Last time we saw how Bernardino Nogara built the Vatican financial machine, making huge profits during the Great Depression. But in 1939, Nogara was faced with yet another challenge, and yet again, he managed to make really good profits. During the war years, Nogara was still financial advisor to the Vatican, and Nogara, on behalf of the Vatican, had invested in assets, industries, stocks, and properties all over the globe. And now it was all at risk of being seized or frozen. In order to minimize losses, Nogara decided to spread the assets across multiple countries. He started by transferring huge amount of bonds and gold reserves to JP Morgan in US, which at the time wasn't yet part of the conflict. He also had an account with Morgan Grenfell, a sister bank of JP Morgan in UK. On the Axis side, since the Vatican didn't have its own bank yet, it was relying heavily on the Italian banks, but also it had an active account with a German bank called Reichsbank, which would later be used for transactions between Vatican and a Swiss bank. As we know, Nogara also was heavily relying on shell companies, one of which was Profima, a Swiss company that he bought in 1938. Through Profima and on behalf of the Vatican, he was able to invest in blacklisted companies that were profiting from the war, one of which was Sudameris, a South American bank that was actually financing the Nazis. As I mentioned in the previous video, Nogara was a member of directors of an Italian bank which owned a major share in Sudameris, meaning that Nogara had actual influence on Sudameris itself. Now, Nogara was a very discreet man, which is why the Vatican loved him so much. He was very careful throughout the years to not leave many trails. So the information available is very limited, but it helps to paint a picture. Basically, the Vatican now had assets spread among allies, Axis, and neutral countries, meaning that whatever the outcome of the war would be, their losses would be limited. But there was one big problem with this system. Both parts of the conflict, as it's natural, were blocking each other's assets and freezing bank accounts. And this also applied to neutral countries. What this basically means is that if you're in an Axis country or on the Axis side, you cannot have a bank account in an allies country and vice versa. But also it means that if you're neutral, you have to mind your own business and not going around storing assets or opening bank accounts for any of the countries involved in the conflict. The Vatican, as a religious entity, managed to get an exception from this rule, and it was really the only country benefiting from this special treatment. And that was because if you think about the countries involved, like US, Italy, and Germany, most of their population is Catholic, and antagonizing the Vatican meant antagonizing a huge cut of their own people. But to be fair, the Vatican also supported various communities and churches in need through activities and charities, which kind of helped their case that they needed to have access to resources in different countries. Some of the documents do reveal that money was sent to fund humanitarian activities to help troops and populations. In 1944, the Vatican provided thousands of meals to citizens in need in Rome, and it also imported food from Argentina and Spain to Italy and Greece. But the British government was keeping an eye on Nogara, and at some point they started to suspect that Nogara was up to something. They went as far as believing that Nogara was a spy for the Axis side, and they wanted to block all their assets and bank accounts in the UK. To be fair to the British government, in 1944, the OSS agents, which are the precursors of the CIA, would discover something concrete. Basically, the Reichsbank, the German bank, was transferring funds to the Vatican through a Swiss bank multiple times, which meant that yes, Nogara was up to something. However, the Vatican wasn't gonna let the British block their accounts, so they reached out and got the US government involved. Now, I am not entirely sure why the US would help the Vatican in this specific instance. I can only speculate that maybe Nogara had really good connections at JP Morgan, which exercised some influence. But there is also another very interesting figure, and that was Cardinal Spellman. During the specific years, he was Archbishop of New York, but before that he had spent some time in Rome and had connections in the Vatican. On top of that, it is also reported that he was a close confidant to President Roosevelt, offering support throughout the war. Now, Spellman was a really interesting man, and considering his proximities to very influential figures of the time, he ended up becoming a very powerful person in the Catholic circles. It is said that Spellman provided financial advice to the Pope, but he also used his influence and connections to secure better deals for the Vatican's investments in the US. Then, in 1943, President Roosevelt decided to send Spellman to Europe to advocate for peace and freedom. Now, a French intelligence historian, Yvonne de Noël, alleged in his book that since Spellman had special military protection and status, he was able to move large bags of gold and money across different countries. And this is part of a broader theory according to which priests who travel across countries for humanitarian activities and whatnot were able to carry bags of money across the borders for, money laundering, or just simply for storing assets in neutral countries. And here I want to give you a bit of context, because yes, it is clear that the Vatican tried to maintain good relationships with allies countries, but above everything, the Vatican cared about itself. In the previous video, we saw how the Lateran Treaty provided the Vatican with independence, money, and government bonds. And the treaty was signed with Mussolini, which was still in power at the time. That meant that the Vatican didn't really have the freedom or the willingness to criticize Mussolini or his government. But also, because of the 1 billion lire in government bonds, the Vatican actually had an active interest in Italian's economy doing well. On top of that, in 1933, the Vatican signed a document with Hitler. The document was basically about the church status in Germany. Obviously, he wanted the church support, or at least to maintain a very good relationship. And that signed document reconfirmed the church tax, which was imposed in Germany since 1919 and was going straight into the Vatican pockets, would remain in place. Now, as you can imagine, during wartime, the church is not really collecting that many donations, which meant that the tax was coming in handy. But that also meant that on one side, the Pope had moral pressure of denouncing these governments. On the other side, though, he had a lot to lose. So, in the end, the Vatican proclaimed its neutrality, at least on the surface. Anyway, aside from Nogara profiting from the war through companies like Sudameris, he also found another very interesting way to make profit. He invested in insurance companies. Specifically, he invested in insurance companies that were profiting from the victims of the Holocaust, such as La Fondiaria and Assicurazioni Generali. La Fondiaria didn't even bother to hide its sympathies for the fascist government, and at some point it fired all its Jewish employees. Assicurazioni Generali, on the other hand, was one of the main companies that made the most money from this scam, and in most recent years has agreed to pay the claims made by family members and heirs of the victims of the Holocaust. But how did this scam work? Well, actually, many insurance companies in Eastern Europe were selling life insurance policies to Jewish people. Now, given the situation, the families of anyone who died couldn't really claim the policies because they were either hiding, imprisoned, or worse. But even after the war ended, those companies still wouldn't pay any of the claims. They used excuses like, "We lost the policies," or that the communist government nationalized everything, which is, by the way, the claim that Assicurazioni Generali made, blaming their Eastern European branch. So during the war years, because they weren't paying that many claims, their profits looked good on paper. Therefore, the stock was doing good. Therefore, the Vatican was profiting. In 1942, the Vatican and Nogara, wanting more operational freedom, created the Vatican Bank, formerly known as IOR, which acted both as a normal bank and as a central bank. The Vatican at the time was the only country that wasn't on any blacklist, meaning that they were free to conduct business with anyone. But until 1942, they had to rely on external bank, meaning that every transaction was leaving a trail. And too many trails could lead to potential restrictions. So the creation of the Vatican Bank actually meant total freedom and privacy. And by total freedom, I mean total freedom. Because the bank was located in the Vatican State, it had its own special rules. Like the IOR wasn't subject to any taxes, didn't have to run any audits, it didn't have to provide annual reports nor show any profit, which is a rule that only changed recently. And also, until around the year 2000, the Vatican had the right to destroy the record of any of their transactions. And here's the key. The IOR wasn't just any regular bank. It acted more as a clearinghouse. So money from shell companies would be moved into an IOR account. Then, in the mix with everything else, would come out on the other side as clean money. To put it very simply, the Vatican could conduct business with anyone they wanted, without anyone knowing about it. The bank accounts of the Vatican Bank were generally for clergymen and residents of the Vatican State. But as long as you knew someone on the inside, you could easily get a bank account open, especially if you showed up with a bag full of money. Naturally, the bank started attracting many wealthy Italian citizens that, given the state of their country, couldn't really export money anywhere else, but also wanted to safeguard their assets. Eventually, though, it would end up attracting more than just regular wealthy Italian citizens. The bank would be used to move money between Axis, Allies, and neutral countries, particularly towards the end of the war, when it was clear that Germany was about to lose, and many people were planning their escape. But that's a story for the next video.